Welcome to the Win Win Evangelism Podcast. I'm Tina Waldrom from Evangelism in Australia. I love helping you feel confident and inspired to share your faith. Whether you're an individual or a pastor looking to help your church engage in evangelism naturally and, more importantly, consistently. Before today's interview with Mark McCrindle from McCrindle Research, I just want to invite you to the Share Jesus membership, where you and your church congregation can receive my ongoing support and training to share Jesus naturally and consistently week after week. I really believe that it's time for you and your church to reap the seeds that you've been sowing. Something on my heart this year. I'd love to personally meet and equip you and your church. So to find out more, you can go to sharejesus.com.au. Well, today I'm delighted to be joined by Mark McCrindle, the principal of McCrindle Research, one of Australia's leading social research and trends organisations. Mark and his team specialise in understanding what's shaping Australian society, from shifts in beliefs and spirituality to how people relate to religion and community. In our conversation, we'll explore some of the latest research on faith and belief in Australia, including the emerging trends in how Australians think about Christianity, spirituality and meaning. And we'll dig into what that data practically means for the church, for outreach, and for everyday believers like you and I wanting to share our faith in this ever-changing cultural landscape. Welcome to you, Mark.
Great to be with you, Tina.
Fantastic to have you along. So just so our listeners know, I've known of Mark and been in Mark's seminars across our country for 20 years. And I've just got to say, what an incredible ministry. And although I feel like I know you so well, Mark, you don't know me, but I know you so well. And it's so exciting to have you on the show today.
Oh, thanks, Tina. Great ministry you've got, and looking forward to being part of this.
Thank you so much. Mark, let's start off by maybe you could just briefly explain how McCrindle Research tracks faith and belief in Australia. What is even the process? How does that happen?
Well, firstly, we look at the big data sets that exist, like the national census. In Australia, we're blessed to have that every 5 years. It looks at population and housing, but it also looks at things like the religion that someone has. It looks at culture, and that can get a sense as to how the population is changing, what we need to be aware of, where people are living, and indeed other conditions that they might have, like health conditions. And the recent census showed mental health the number one issue. So all of these give us more than just a population figure. They show a little bit of the mind and mood and attitudes and religious persuasions of our nation as well. We conduct a lot of national surveys to understand the quantitative side of what's happening around faith and belief and attitudes to Christianity in the church, and then a lot of in-depth research as well in terms of qualitative or focus groups or in-depth interviews. So those methodologies that we conduct fairly regularly through the year and then longitudinally give us a good snapshot and indeed long-term pattern as to what's happening in this nation.
Yeah, very interesting and so crucial for us to not just have good thoughts about what's happening or that anecdotal evidence of what's happening, but really have that grounded research. What do you see as the biggest shifts happening right now, especially, say, compared to 10 or even 5 years ago?
Well, it's probably that, while we're well aware that cultural Christianity has been dissipating for decades, people don't go to church just because it's the good social thing to do. They're not calling themselves Christians if they're not active in the practice of that faith. We've all seen these trends and aware of that. But probably what's most interesting to me is that the trends have shifted, and it's not that people are post-Christian anymore. I would say, indeed, they're increasingly post-secular. That is, that all of the promises of the capitalistic approach to life, of the freedoms of a modern technological society have not delivered. We've seen a shift from materialism to, more recently, economic despondency. Even the Aussie dream of home ownership seems less likely to be achieved. From tech optimism to tech skepticism, where people are seeing that technology is impairing their life rather than enhancing their life. They're skeptical about new technology, even as AI starts to grow. The idea that you work hard in Australia and you can achieve is giving way to quiet quitting, or people seeking more work-life balance, or saying no to things. And while there's been a lot made of pushback on the institutional church, Australians are deconstructing everything. They're pushing back on any institutions. There's low trust across the board, not just in the institutional church. So probably what's been fascinating to me is to see not just how we sit in this post-Christian environment, but how every other alternative has not delivered at all. And that has led to a counterflow, to an alternate shift. You might say a counter trend, where people actually are looking back to Christianity and exploring faith once more.
Yeah, that's a great distinction to make, that there's not just that distrust or unrest with the church as an institution, because we hear that a lot, but it's the institution in general of what's going on, something for us to think through. Some of your recent work talks about, and really ties in nicely to what you were just saying, this undercurrent of faith that we're now seeing in the nation. Can you unpack that a little bit, and why, I guess, this particular narrative is more complex than just declining numbers?
Yeah, well, that's a key issue, because we're all well aware of the prevailing current, the main current that we see, and that is a shift, a drift from Christianity. In fact, in 10 years from 2011 to 2021, the total numbers of Australians in the census that identified their religion as Christianity dropped from 61% to 44%. So 1 in 3 of those who used to say Christianity 10 years later no longer did. That's a pretty clear current. But what we probably don't realize is that there's an undercurrent, and that's what our research was looking at, of people who are going the other way. About 800,000 in Australia every 5-year period who were in the no religion category are moving across to Christianity. And so that's consistent. That's nearly 2.5 million people just in that same period of time have gone from no religion to Christianity, even though a lot of people are drifting from that culture of Christianity to say no religion. So it's just to highlight that there are trends and counter trends, that there's an underflow there. And when we looked at some subgroups, particularly, for example, older Australians, they were the most likely to have, in a prior census, said no religion, and more recently said Christianity. And it just highlights that those seeds of faith that are planted in young lives for many baby boomers, maybe 50 or 60 or 70 years ago, don't necessarily wither over time for some, as maybe they reflect on their own mortality or illness. Maybe grandchildren come along and they're thinking about the future. That does get them to think again about the deeper things of life, and that's where many are making a recommitment, or indeed searching back to the things of the Christian faith. So that was a key insight that we found in this research as well.
That's a huge insight, because in Australia we have such an ageing population. One of the most ageing populations in the world, I believe, has a big economic impact. But what you're saying there, what I feel like you're saying to me, is there is a lot of older people in our communities right now that it would be of benefit if churches and Christians as individuals started to lean into a little bit more with these people as they are positioning or pivoting back, so to speak, towards Christian seeds in their life, or a nominal even Christian faith of the past.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Tina. And I think it's right that churches invest so much in children's ministry and youth ministry, and the data shows that about 4 in 5 churchgoers made their faith commitment before the age of 20, so in their childhood or teenage years. So that's when the majority of people come to faith. But keep in mind, 1 in 5 make a decision as an adult. And for some of them, it's mid or later in their life. And so we ought not forget to invest in middle-age and seniors ministry. We ought to look at some of this data and recognize that those older people after a life of reflecting and maybe having had those early Christian experiences and having turned their back on that, reflecting once more on what matters, and there's a resurgence. So I think this is important to keep in mind. How are we engaging with older Australians? And of course, they have influence not only over their children, but their grandchildren. So it's a critical generation to connect with, and a generation that might have moved away from Christianity, but aren't post-Christian, because it's still there, some of those seeds of faith. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got the young people who I would almost say are pre-Christian, that they've grown up in a society where they haven't even heard of Christianity enough to reject it. They just don't know much about it at all. So there's great opportunities for different reasons at both ends of the age spectrum in Australia.
Yeah, gosh, my mind's just going at 100 miles an hour now. I'm thinking of everything, Mark, of all the spin-offs of that. Because honestly, if we just thought of those elderly people, so to speak, I could spend 6 months just writing content around that and how we could be more effective in that space, because there's a harvest field that's really ripe there. Look, we've been talking around bits and pieces, but what do you think we're battling the most when trying to share Jesus individually or as a church right now in Australia?
I think we're battling our own fears and perhaps lack of faith of the sovereignty of God to work. People often say Australia is hard soil, people aren't interested. You'll invite people to an outreach event or maybe just invite them to read the Bible with you and they're not interested. We found the reverse. We found that about half of Australians are extremely very open to having spiritual discussions, and it was much higher with the older Australians. It was more than half of young people, those Generation Z, so those in their teens and 20s, are extremely very open to discussing the Christian faith, even if that's a different view to their own. And when it came to attending something, not just having a chit chat, but now we're saying, come along. I don't have all the answers, but we've got this thing at my church, or there's this outreach event that I think you'll enjoy. If invited by someone that they know, a family member or friend, we've got almost 2 in 3, just under 2 in 3 young people, that is teenagers and 20-somethings, say they'd be extremely very likely to attend. So give out 2 tickets, you pretty much guarantee that one of them will take up that ticket and turn up. It's not that people aren't coming, it's that we're not inviting. And so that, for me, was the fascinating insight from this research. Yes, with the older Australians, you've probably got to invite 3 people to get one to turn up. But for younger people, you've got a more than 1 in 2 chance of them turning up. Such is their openness. They're not skeptical. They don't really know much about it, and they're more likely than not to be wanting to explore the Christian faith, to understand it, and more broadly a spiritual worldview.
What an interesting insight that one is. I've got kids in that demographic, and it is interesting to hear what they say about, people being open for those conversations. Just a quick break. A lot of evangelism training is confrontational, makes people feel awkward. We've worked hard to make all of our training the opposite of that, making evangelism something that everyone can be a part of. If you or your church are looking for that type of training, go to evangelisminaustralia.com and look at our training tab for some great options. Now let's get back to it. When it comes to those younger ones that are open to those spiritual conversations, even if they're not overtly religious, what are the other implications of this for people wanting to share the gospel relationally rather than institutionally?
Well, it's so important because this is the generation that have grown up hearing about and valuing, my truth and me doing me, or me being me. And so if we are to share with young people, or particularly think about young people sharing their own testimony with their peers, that has great power. It doesn't just have to be some apologetical theological discussion. It doesn't just have to be some well-equipped gospel message. What has power with young people is your own story, is your own experience. When we looked at what brings people to faith, the number one top of the line impact of Australians when we surveyed them was hearing a story of someone who has been changed by their faith. Because Australians want to change. Everyone wants to change. Everyone wants to do better and improve. And everything else people try, it doesn't measure up because they continually fail. But when we share the story how someone else changed us inside and broke the back of the biggest challenge we had of sin and a problematic lifestyle, when we share the good news of Jesus, that is a story of change. They can see evidence of someone right in front of them, someone they know or someone that they can relate to, and that has great power. And so the power of a testimony, the power of one's own story, particularly when delivered in a relational context, has a big impact for young people today who may not know all the background of the Bible or Christianity, but they'll listen to that story and be impacted by it.
Yeah, it begs the question for me. I wonder how prepared or willing people are to even share their story. I don't know if we have much research on that at all.
Well, what we have found in our analysis here is that people are pretty timid, because we've grown up hearing that Australians don't like us to talk about politics or religion, that Australians are pretty easygoing, but they don't want to hear from the Bible bashers, that they don't want us to get too intense about those religious things. Oh, you found religion, have you? We'll keep that to yourself. That's our perception of the Australian psyche, but it's not the current reality, particularly amongst a generation who are very open to that, who haven't, again, rejected Christianity. They haven't heard enough to make a decision on it. So, yes, if we can just be those witnesses, which is what Jesus called us to be, didn't he? He told us to go to Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and the end of the earth, and not to be necessarily missionaries or apologists or preachers, but to be my witnesses, Jesus said, just to give a testimony of what Christ has done for us. So that's all we're called to be, and that's turns out what has great impact with this next generation today.
Yep, 100%. And I love that because that's the model from the beginning. When I read through the New Testament, I'm like, it's the gospel just gossiped away, to people in the neighbourhoods, to the sporting clubs, to the universities, etc. And I think just doing that casually, not to somehow getting back to being able to share my life just as your mate would share their life of what they did on the weekend, just a casual sharing of what Jesus has done in your life, because we hear believers all the time saying how these wonderful things that God's doing in their life, but just being able to share that naturally with the world around us, particularly these younger ones that you're saying that are don't have this already objection to Christianity because they don't know what it is. In our current culture, is there anything for you that stands out that, and there probably is because you spend your life in this space, that as Christians we really should be aware of this right now in terms of not tripping up, so to speak? What do we need to be aware of in the culture as a Christian and wanting to be that faithful witness?
Well, the number one value that Australians look for is authenticity. Australians, particularly when it comes to religion, as they would say, can smell a hypocrite. And if we look at the history, even the recent history of the church in Australia, the Royal Commission into child abuse and other things, it's that hypocrisy that comes out. Christians are supposed to be, do-gooders, Australians would say, but here they are, doing these terrible things. And so they want to know that Christians can walk their talk. They want to know that we've been changed by our faith before we go introducing that to others. And that's where our story and our witness can be powerful. And we don't need all the answers in that regard. But what's remarkable is that the younger generations, when they understand the Christian message and respond to it, are the most likely to be active in the practice of that. So if you look at all of the population who said their religion is Christianity in the census, and then you look at how many of them attend church on a regular basis, for the baby boomers, the older generation, only 1 in 4 who says Christianity goes to church because, there's still a big swathe that are cultural Christians. Like, well, when I fill in the census, I tick that Christianity box or this denomination because that's what my parents were or that's how I was raised and that's what I tick. But they're not active in the practice of that. But by the time you get to young people, it's very different. It's almost the opposite figure than the older generations. 68% who say their faith is Christianity attend church regularly, that is weekly or at least once a month. So they are most likely, if they say their faith is Christianity, to be practicing that weekly and daily, to be sincere in it. Because for a young person to say their religion is Christianity, what they're saying is they're swimming against the tide. They're going against the secular approach. They're sincere and serious about it. That's what they want to see in others as well. Someone who says, well, if your religion, if your faith is Christianity, surely you're living that out. Surely you are a Christ follower, and that's going to be evidence. So that's just another evidence that authenticity, walking your talk, being who you are. If you've got the name, the brand, I'm a Christian, they expect to see it, and certainly that's what they're doing as well. So I found that was encouraging to see that the more we look at the census results of those particular young people ticking that Christianity box, the more it's not cultural Christianity, it's not heritage or history or ticking a box because that's how I was raised. It's because they have made a faith decision and are Christ followers.
Yeah, so interesting. And yes, people want to see it. They don't want the hypocrisy. They want to see it. And Mark, I think that we underestimate how bright the Christian witness is when it's seen. You know, it's such a glaring light in the society that we live in. So it does seem like a great opportunity right now.
Sure does. And we've found that we've surveyed Australians, asked them what they think of the church, what they think of different denominations, what they think of religion in Australia. And Australians are very suspicious of institutional religion. And we discussed that briefly early on, as they are any big, powerful institution, big corporates, government, etc. They're skeptical. And so the institutional church, where it seems to have power or connected to politics or maybe making decisions from on high, hierarchical, they're suspicious. But as for the local church up the road, as for the Christian ministry they see, as for the Salvos or others that are doing great things when there's an issue or problem, that's their experience of the church and Christian ministry in action. They're very warm towards it. They think it's great, and they think those genuine Christians in that work are great as well. So the local church and local Christians they know are very positively regarded, even if people might have some suspicion against institutional or traditional church denominations. So we've got to keep that in mind. And what we are is not part of an institution where people that follow Christ in obedience and want to share how he's changed our life with others. So forget what people think of the institution or the denomination or the history or the brand. They are warm towards the Christians that they know, and that's a positive thing.
Yes, amen, absolutely. Let me ask you a question that's a little bit left of centre, but not really. There's a lot of church planting going on in Australia now. A lot of talk around that space. You know, I'm involved a lot in that space. What would you do yourself, Mark, with all the information that you have in your mind that you know, and you had to go plant a church? What would you be thinking? What would you be doing? What would be going on in your mind?
There'd be a few things there from the research. Firstly, I would make it definitely volunteer-based in terms of getting a lot of people, or as many as we can, involved in that, because that's, again, where the connection comes through the people, not just through the hierarchy. So, rather than just sort of one person or a couple trying to get it done as the startup, let's try to involve others in the role, and particularly as we think about this next generation who are wanting to live out their faith in active ways, wanting to serve, wanting to volunteer. They're looking for a role. Sometimes we're almost too slow. We sort of think, well, you've got to earn the right and you've got to pay dues and are you mature enough? And there's an element to which, we don't lay on hands hastily, as it were. But as for getting involved in ministry, let's give these young people a go and give them an opportunity to serve, to grow. The second thing is to make sure we're understanding the context that we're in, because churches will look different, suburb to suburb, socioeconomic to socioeconomic. The truth doesn't, the gospel doesn't, and the Bible that we teach doesn't change, but there's nuance into how it looks. And the body of Christ is diverse in all its different flavors and styles around the world, and that's true even within Australia. So while we've got a biblical pattern of church, it'll look slightly different. I think understanding the context is important in that regard. The third thing I would say is don't water down the teaching and the doctrine, because we've got a generation that not only are increasingly educated, but they're looking for substance. They're looking for something solid. They've heard a lot of hype out there. They're skeptical of what AI is generating or what social media is promoting. What they want is something solid. They're almost like a generation of Bereans we read about in Acts, don't we? And they were noble because they listened to what the Apostle Paul was teaching and checked against Scripture to see whether it was so. We've got a generation of young people that are wanting meat, not sort of milk. They do want solid teaching, and that's going to equip them well for their future and to defend the faith or to teach others. And I think that's maybe what we've missed over the last generation. We've probably made a very consumer-friendly church, a very seeker-friendly church, a very engaging church, easy to access. But we've left, I think, a generation bereft of biblical truth, of that Christian foundation and of good theological understanding. So don't water down the truth, ramp it up for this next generation so they also can be equipped to likewise teach others.
Yeah, that's a great response. Thank you very much. And so helpful for church planters that will also be listening along to this. Mark, over the years, you have produced so much research, you've engaged with so many people, and there's so much information that McCrindle have produced. I know that we can all go to mccrindle.com.au, but I understand that you started a new initiative. You've got a kind of a subscription, and so that people can access all of that. Would you mind just telling us about that? Because not everyone knows about it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we've put all of our 20 years of research and all of our ongoing content as well. We do 4 or 5 major research pieces a year, plus a lot of infographics and visual reports and webinars and other content. And it's all up there, all available, the full vault of all the research, fully accessible, just in a very simple subscription model called McCrindle Plus. And it's I think even a few dollars a week is sort of the cost. So it's very, very affordable. It's really low cost because we just want to create this stuff and get it out there so it can be used and you can access it and cite and reproduce it and do what you like. So that's the McCrindle Plus service. And there's a lot of our faith-based research there as well. And I'd encourage people to grab it or go to the website and the blogs, and there's a lot of freely accessible information there as well.
Yeah, it's so exciting. Thank you. And again, thank you for your time, but for the years of service in putting this together for our nation. I know there's other research organisations around the world, but to have an Australian-based organisation looking specifically in our culture, I know I speak on behalf of thousands of pastors in our nation. Thank you very much. It's been extremely helpful, and can't wait to see what you do with the census data and package it all up for us. So do all the work so we don't have to do it, so to speak.
Thanks, Tina. Well, yes, another census year, so we're excited about that. More numbers, more data, and just look at Changing Australia. That's what we'll be doing. So thank you. Great to chat with you, Tina, and thanks for having me on the podcast and for all that you do.
Absolute pleasure. And don't forget, in the show notes, we'll produce off some questions for you that can help you or small groups in your church so you can engage with this material and more. And we'll drop all the links to mccrindle.com.au and other areas of the organisation that you can engage with. Hope this is a real blessing to you. Again, Mark, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Tim.
We're here to tell a story with a lasting